Hi everyone, welcome back to This Week in Impact, where I break down some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week with other ImpactAlpha editors. I'm Brian Walsh. It's Thursday, July 18th. Today I'm joined once again by Jessica Pothering, Senior Editor of Deal Flow and Emerging Markets. We'll discuss Jessica's recent piece on refugee-lens investing, efforts being made to shore up the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund before the November election, plus an excerpt from the newest entry to the ImpactAlpha podcast network, Capital Gains. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, Brian. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Now, turning to your piece this week on refugee-lens investing, I was blown away by some of the statistics that you reported, such as more than 117 million people have been displaced worldwide because of conflict or natural disaster, and humanitarian crises now last on average of 17 years, an amount of time that is difficult for humanitarian grants alone to keep up with the human needs. You reported on efforts to mobilize private capital to meet the financing gaps that open when humanitarian grant funding runs out or is insufficient. What have you learned?
Yeah, just to go back to some of those statistics that you mentioned, I mean, there is about a $40 billion annual shortfall in the humanitarian aid that's needed to address all of these sort of crisis zones in the world. And what was really startling to me when I was doing this research was finding out that the number of people who are in imminent need of humanitarian aid has doubled over the last 5 years. And aid budgets, actually, most of which come from like 10 donor countries, have also gone up in that period of time, especially since the pandemic. But they're really vulnerable to, both the sort of economic environment and the political winds, right? So there's no guarantee that the money that's available today is going to be available tomorrow or when the next crisis arrives. And so kind of what the crux of this reporting was how humanitarian aid organizations, and in this case, that my piece specifically spotlights the International Rescue Committee, are thinking about the types of financing that are needed both in those protracted crisis zones and the types of money that are needed to help stabilize crisis-affected and displaced communities for the long term, so that they can settle and they can rebuild, over time.
So these global NGOs have a traditional playbook of returning to immediate crises and emergencies, but now with the length of these crises extending, they really have to expand the tools in their toolbox to meet the longer-term needs of refugees.
Right. So you think of humanitarian aid organizations like the first responders, right? And they're really good at making sure the food gets in and the tents get built so that people have shelter and that medical treatment is provided. But what they're not accustomed to doing is engaging with these communities, for decades and ensuring that they have piped water or electricity or schools or hospitals. And that is increasingly what is needed in these cases. And what's also increasingly happening is that communities aren't returning home. So when they land in a new place, or even if they're displaced internally within their own country's borders, that becomes the new long-term reality for a lot of people. And the types of money that are needed for effectively, essential infrastructure is really different than what humanitarian aid organizations are both funded to do or equipped to do.
Now, in recent years, some of these global humanitarian organizations like UNICEF or Save the Children or Mercy Corps have all launched venture capital funds and other kind of in-house innovative financing models to fund things like young social enterprises that help deliver essential products and services like access to finance, energy, healthcare, and education. But from what I understand, the IRC is taking a slightly different approach.
Sure. I mean, venture funding is great, but it's not going to solve all of the issues. And it's venture funding certainly doesn't really solve the infrastructure issue that I just mentioned. And so what the IRC is doing, they're taking more of an advisory approach at this point. I think I spoke with the head of the Innovative Finance Group at the IRC, this woman, Ellen Brooks, and from my conversation with her, it became clear that private investors are really wary of going into crisis afflicted and displaced communities because of their perception of risk, right? That these are highly unstable places. And so what the IRC is trying to do, they're taking on more of an advisory role, talking to private sector investors, and trying to bring that refugee lens to them, to sort of help educate them on how to think about displaced communities and refugee needs in the sort of development finance investments that they're making.
So it sounds like they recognize that there's a need for long-term solutions. They require a different type of money, and that type of money doesn't exist. So IRC sounds like they're doing some basic field building to help develop those tools that would bring that kind of new type of money to bear on refugees.
That's right. I mean, I think there's not a great estimate out there for how much private capital is going into displaced communities. From what I've seen, it's, maybe in the hundreds of millions of dollars, certainly nothing close to the aid budget shortfall of, several tens of billions of dollars. And so what the IRC's innovative finance role at this point is really just a lot of experimentation. And some of the projects, they're working on are really interesting. They came in as an advisor to this water pipeline infrastructure project in northern Jordan. So bringing piped water for the first time to about 120,000 people, roughly 20% of whom are Syrian refugees who have come into Jordan and been living in that area since the Syrian civil war started 13 years ago. That's 13 years. There's no sign of when those refugees will be able to return home, if ever. And so they're, more or less a permanent part of that community now. And so what the IRC is doing is educating the development finance partner and the Jordanian government on the specific needs of the refugees in that community, because the IRC has been there working with them for over a decade.
Now, you noted that private investors are usually scared by this kind of investing. And so what kind of de-risking tools does the space need?
There's a few examples of, just the sort of standard finance de-risking mechanisms like guarantees, but political risk insurance being applied to displaced communities are certainly not enough at this point, but there are a handful of models that others could replicate. There's an example in Somalia of a solar hybrid mini-grid development that's being put together by Cross Boundary Energy and Cube Energy. And in order to get investors comfortable with that deal, the World Bank's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency provided almost $6 million in a political risk guarantee. And what that has done for that project is it enables investors to look at it more like a solar financing project rather than an infrastructure project in a highly turbulent country.
So climate change is only exacerbating this refugee crisis. And as you reported, in the next 25 years, more than 200 million people could become climate refugees. And perhaps as many as 1 billion more could voluntarily move as climate migrants. So how does the climate crisis intersect with the refugee crisis? And what are some ways that people are thinking about mitigating that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I chatted with Ellen about this, I asked her how climate change was showing up in the IRC's work. And she said, the IRC has perhaps only officially been talking about climate change for a few years or so, but it's always been present in the work that they've done. And now it is a key factor in all of their work. And to the statistics that I highlighted in my piece, only going to increasingly become more so. And so one of the new tools that the IRC is looking at is how to help host countries for refugees and migrants improve their resilience and humanitarian outcomes locally. Because despite the political rhetoric that's happening here in Europe and in the US about migration, the reality is that most of the people who are crossing borders, whether it's for a political crisis or because of a climate crisis, most of them are landing in neighboring countries which are also low income, also under-resourced, also highly vulnerable to climate change, and now are facing this added pressure of supporting a destabilized population. And so, and many of them are highly indebted. And so one of the tools that the IRC is shopping around at the moment is an adaptation on what we've seen in the last couple of years, these debt for nature swaps. And what those are is it allows low income, highly indebted countries to refinance a portion of their sovereign debt at a lower interest rate, and in exchange for climate conservation or biodiversity preservation commitments.
All right, super interesting, Jessica. Now, one final question before we switch topics. The term refugee-lens investing, what is the goal of using that term and applying that term? If, as you noted, private investors might be scared off by the perceived risk about investing in refugees, then why use the term refugee-lens itself?
Well, I think what's coming up here is that refugees aren't the problem, right? It's that there's a lack of understanding of these communities. And so what the IRC and other humanitarian organizations are trying to do is effectively act as a translator to the private sector, with them and the work that humanitarian organizations have been doing for all this time. Humanitarian organizations, they understand these communities because they've been working in them for such a long period of time. So they can see that, okay, in a refugee camp in Kenya that has existed for 30 years, there is a thriving entrepreneurial community because people make ends meet when they've been living in a refugee camp for several decades and have children there. And, there's multiple generations that are growing up there. So it's more just about educating private investors and development finance institutions about the needs of these communities, the investment opportunities within these communities, and how to design their investments with more inclusivity in mind.
And indeed, so that these refugees who have oftentimes risked their lives to travel great distances to safety might not just represent a risk, but an opportunity from an investment standpoint. All right, well, let's take a quick break there. When we come back, how the EPA seeks ways to mobilize private capital as it races to beef up green banking.
Every day, ImpactAlpha uncovers stories that make a difference to impact investors. I am Zalema Bibo, Chief Operating Officer at ImpactAlpha, here with a special reminder. Subscribers get the award-winning brief 5 days a week and so much more. Unlock exclusive coverage, get access to subscriber-only calls and Slack channels, plus search hundreds of jobs and internships at the ImpactAlpha Career Hub. What are you waiting for? Subscribe today. Learn more at impactalpha.com/subscribe.
And we're back. Now, betting markets give former President Trump over a 60% chance of winning the election in November, which might put in doubt some aspects of President Biden's signature climate legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. As our colleagues David Bank and Amy Cortese reported this week, the EPA and dozens of key allies are scrambling to stand up a $27 billion plan to create a major new market for green financing. But the clock is ticking. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, one of the biggest opportunities for community-level climate impact and community finance in decades, is on the line here. Now, Jessica, why is this federal funding potentially in jeopardy?
So when the GGRF was passed into law with the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a September 30th, 2024 deadline for actually dispersing that $27 billion that you just mentioned. And, that's the end of the government fiscal year. And so money that's not spent by September 30th could be at risk under a new administration or new Congress. And so the urgency is getting that money out the door by September 30th, given that we're in an election year, and also given that the Republican lawmakers have said very openly that they want to scrap the GGRF.
And take a step back. What's at stake with the GGRF specifically?
So the GGRF was designed to ensure that any of the green transition work that's happening in the United States has a broad-based impact, and that money flows to lower income, underinvested, historically underrepresented communities to ensure that they're also part of the green transition and benefit from that.
All right, so that funding potentially is in the crosshairs if this September 30th deadline is not met.
That's right, and September 30th is one deadline. Actually, the more urgent deadline is the end of this month, end of July, and that is the timeline that the coalition partners that the EPA selected back in April for actually dispersing GGRF funding. That is their deadline for getting their contracts in order. And I mean, this is a huge new government program. They're accessing this money comes with a lot of conditions. And since it's a first-time program, there are a lot of details just to be hammered out. And so it's really important that these partners meet this July 31st deadline so that the EPA can actually disperse the money to them by that September 30th deadline.
All right, so it sounds like the clock is ticking as the clock is ticking on this segment. Before we go today, we wanted to feature a clip from Capital Gains, the latest addition to the ImpactAlpha podcast network. Co-hosted by Matt Posner of Court Street Group and James McIntyre, a municipal affordable housing and clean energy finance expert, Capital Gains seeks to untangle the threads of policy, politics, and money in pursuit of a more engaged citizenry. Let's take a quick listen to an excerpt.
Welcome to today's episode, Vote It Out, where we delve into the intricate web of American politics and policy, dissecting the ramifications of a Congress divided along partisan lines and districts shaped by gerrymandering. In this episode, we shine a light on the evolving landscape of Washington, where the focus has shifted from sending policymakers to the nation's capital to dispatching partisan politicians. As federal government decisions become increasingly polarized, we explore the ripple effects that extend far beyond the Beltway. Large spending bills, often passed in a climate of intense partisanship, are handed down to state and local governments for implementation. The result? Under-resourced communities grappling with the challenges of designing and executing programs that are crucial for their residents. And are we even solving the problems we intend to solve? Today, we'll discuss the challenges faced by state and local governments, forced to be federal policymakers and competitors in a race for federal funds, rather than concentrating on a meaningful on-the-ground implementation. We'll shed light on how this approach not only diminishes the efficiency of public services, but also hampers the ability of dedicated public servants to address the pressing needs of their communities.
So before we dive into the meat of this discussion today, you've worked at the state government level, across state and local governments. Any observations on when we're going to get a kumbaya moment across governments in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think actually that's a real challenge in the U.S. right now, is the fact that state and local governments are incredibly siloed. The fact that in many cases, we have very, very similar problems in communities across the United States, and yet they're all problem solving by themselves in a vacuum.
I've heard you say this since as long as I've known you, that I like how you put it, that the happiest and healthiest human being is the least expensive human. How can government be better around doing this?
It's something I fundamentally believe, is that if we solve for the human being, we will solve for the best outcomes for our systems, for ourselves financially. If you think about it, I was at an event at the New York Fed when the director of New York Health and Hospitals talked about the cycle of human beings and homelessness in New York. And it's sort of Bellevue, the public hospital, to Rikers, the prison, back to the street, and some combination. And what you end up with is a very, very expensive human being, because I hate to say this, but if you don't solve for that human being, they are going to be on a city's balance sheet the next year as a liability. They're going to have a cost this year and the next year. And so we really need to think about shifting resources to solve for that human being, because ultimately it'll make for less expensive and better outcomes.
Again, that was an excerpt from the new Capital Gains podcast, To listen to the full episode and subscribe, check out our podcast page at impactalpha.com/podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts right now, search for Capital Gains. That's going to do it for This Week in Impact. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thanks a lot, Brian. See you next time.
And thank you all for listening. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen and share this with a friend or colleague. If you want to help out, be sure to rate us and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find the show. For feedback, send us an email to podcast@impactalpha.com. We'd love to hear from you. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join other agents of impact like yourself by subscribing to Impact Alpha. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Jessica Pothering, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.